The official version says Ivan Milat was caught because of brilliant detective work. But Paul Onions filed a formal police report on the 25th of January 1990, naming his attacker, describing the vehicle, and describing the weapon, and that report sat untouched in a New South Wales police file for 4 years, while at least 5 more people were murdered on the same highway. There is a specific kind of unease that comes not from the crime itself, but from the arithmetic that follows it. 7 victims, 1 surviving witness, 1 report filed, 4 years of silence. The mathematics of preventable death are not abstract, they accumulate. And when the full timeline of the Milat case is laid out in sequence, not the version the media preferred, but the documented chronological record, what emerges is not the story of a monster who was eventually caught. It is the story of a system that was handed the answer and chose not to look at it. For decades, the Hume Highway was Australia's most democratic road. It connected Sydney to Melbourne through 900 kilometres of farmland, small towns, and open sky. In the late 1980s, it was also the primary artery for backpackers crossing the country. Young travellers from Germany, England, the United States, and Australia itself, most of them hitchhiking because it was cheap, because it was the done thing, and because Australia had a reputation as one of the safest countries on earth for independent travel. Tourism Australia's promotional materials from 1988 described the corridor as a rite of passage for international visitors. Youth hostels along the route recorded tens of thousands of check-ins annually. What no one publicly acknowledged, and what internal New South Wales police records would later confirm, was that by late 1989, a pattern of disappearances along this specific corridor had already begun to accumulate. Young travellers checking out of hostels, signing off in their travel journals, and then vanishing without trace. No bodies, no coordinated alerts, no response that crossed the jurisdictional boundaries that divided the highway into separate police territories. Just an absence, quiet, unremarked, and growing. The structure of those jurisdictional divisions is not incidental. The Hume Highway passed through the territories of at least 4 separate regional police commands. A disappearance reported in one command did not automatically surface in the intelligence picture of the next. A pattern that was visible when the full corridor was examined as a single unit became invisible when it was divided into administrative segments. This is not speculation. It is the finding of the internal review commissioned by the New South Wales Police following the conviction of Ivan Milat in 1996. The review was not made public. Ivan Robert Marco Milat was born on 27 December 1944 in Guildford, New South Wales, the 5th of 14 children in a family with a documented history of criminal violence. By the time the backpacker murders began, he carried an existing criminal record that included a 1971 charge of raping 2 female hitchhikers, a charge that was ultimately dropped after both complainants withdrew their statements under circumstances that were never formally explained in any public document. He worked for the New South Wales Roads and Traffic Authority as a survey hand on the Hume Highway. He knew the road with professional precision, every rest stop, every fire trail, every stretch of dense bush running parallel to the sealed surface. He drove the corridor regularly, visibly, and entirely without suspicion. One more worker in a high-visibility vest in a landscape populated by them. His access to Belanglo State Forest, the location where all 7 confirmed victims were eventually found, was not incidental. It was occupational. What the official conviction narrative has consistently framed as the profile of a lone predator becomes more complicated when cross-referenced against the statements of people who knew the Milat family during this period. Multiple witnesses interviewed during the 1994 investigation described Ivan as embedded in a social world. Weekend shooting trips, camping excursions in Belanglo State Forest itself, a circle of family members and acquaintances who shared his interests and, in several cases, his geography. The question of who accompanied Ivan Milat to Belanglo State Forest was formally raised during the investigation. It was formally set aside. It was never answered. Belanglo State Forest sits 15 kilometers west of the town of Berrima, in the southern highlands of New South Wales. It covers approximately 820 hectares of dense radiata pine plantation, planted in rows, dark even at midday, with a floor of compacted needles that absorbs sound and footsteps with equal efficiency. It is not remote in any meaningful geographic sense. It sits 140 kilometers from the Sydney Central Business District. It is visible from the highway. On the 19th of September 1992, orienteering enthusiast Keith Caldwell entered the forest on a training run and found what he initially took to be a discarded sleeping bag. It was not a sleeping bag. The remains were those of Joanne Walters, 22, from Wales, and Caroline Clark, 21, from England. Both had been missing since April of that year. Clark had been shot 10 times in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. The wound pattern, 10 shots arranged in a consistent sequence around the cranial perimeter, led forensic pathologist Peter Bradhurst to formally state in his autopsy report that the shooting was not frantic, not reactive, and not disorganized. It was deliberate. It was practiced. 2 weeks after the initial discovery, a broader search of the forest floor produced 5 more victims: Deborah Everest and James Gibson, both 19, from Victoria; Simone Schmidl, 21, from Germany; Gabor Neugebauer, 21, and Anja Habschied, 20, both also from Germany. 7 victims in total, different nationalities, different ages, different points of entry onto the highway. The only shared variable was the road they had each walked, thumb extended, on separate days across separate years, and the forest where all of them ended up. The buried geography of that forest had been waiting. What is not yet resolved is how long it had been in use before September 1992, and by how many people. On the 25th of January 1990, more than 2.5 years before the first bodies were found in Belanglo, a 24-year-old British backpacker named Paul Onions was hitchhiking south on the Hume Highway near Casula when he accepted a lift from a man driving a silver 4-wheel drive. The man introduced himself as Bill. He was middle-aged, powerfully built, and talkative. The conversation was unremarkable for the first 20 minutes. Near the town of Pheasant's Nest, the driver stopped the vehicle without explanation and produced a rope and a revolver. Onions ran. He was pursued along the highway shoulder. He was not caught. He flagged down a passing vehicle, was driven to the nearest town, and filed a formal police report at Bowral Police Station that same afternoon. The report contained a physical description of the attacker, a specific description of the silver 4-wheel drive, and a description of the weapon. It was logged, it was filed, it was not acted upon. Task Force Air was established by New South Wales Police in November 1992, specifically to investigate the Belanglo murders. It ran for over a year before Paul Onions came to its attention. He did not come to its attention because a detective searched the existing report database and found his 1990 statement. He came to its attention because he was living in England in 1993, saw a media report about the Belanglo case, and called Crime Stoppers himself. The report he had filed 3 years earlier, at a police station 90 kilometers from the forest, was in the system the entire time. The question of why it remained unread for 3 years and 4 murders has never received a formal public answer. Task Force Air eventually became one of the largest investigations in Australian police history. More than 100 detectives, over 32 Bowral documents, thousands of individual interviews, and a geographic scope that covered the entire Hume corridor. By any operational measure, it was a serious and well-resourced investigation. By the measure of what it initially failed to find, it is something more complicated. The Milat family name appeared in Task Force Air documents as early as March 1993, not as the result of any investigative breakthrough, but because of an anonymous letter received by detectives that named Ivan Milat directly. The letter was assessed, noted, and not immediately elevated within the investigation hierarchy. The formal explanation offered was volume. The task force was processing thousands of tips simultaneously, and resources had to be allocated against probability assessments. What the documentary record does not explain is why a man with a prior charge for the rape of female hitchhikers, whose professional role placed him physically on the murder corridor, did not immediately represent a higher probability than the assessment appears to have assigned him. Detective Senior Sergeant Clive Small, who led Task Force Air, has stated publicly that the volume of information made genuine prioritization difficult. That account is credible. It is also not the complete account. The internal review conducted after the conviction identified at minimum 3 separate points in the pre-1994 investigative timeline at which information already in the Task Force Air system, if cross-referenced with existing police records, would have produced Milat's name as a primary suspect. Those 3 points are documented. The review's conclusions about systemic failure were filed internally. They were not released. On the 22nd of May 1994, detectives from Task Force Air executed a search warrant at 22 Cinnabar Street, Eagle Vale, the residential address of Ivan Milat. What they found in the course of that search and subsequent searches of related properties was forensically substantial. Camping equipment and clothing belonging to identified victims were recovered. A disassembled Ruger .22 caliber rifle, the weapon type consistent with the wounds documented on Caroline Clark, was found hidden inside a wall cavity in the house. A crossbow bolt of the type recovered from the spine of Deborah Everest was found at a separate property belonging to Ivan's brother, Richard Milat. Ivan Milat was arrested the following morning. He was charged with 7 counts of murder. The 1996 trial, presided over by Justice David Hunt in the New South Wales Supreme Court, ran for 8 months. The defence, led by barrister John Marsden, argued that evidence had been planted, that Milat was the victim of a coordinated conspiracy involving police and family members, and that the real perpetrator remained unidentified. The jury deliberated for 18 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 7 counts. What the trial record contains, and what the media coverage of the verdict chose not to emphasize, is a series of internal notations made by Task Force Air investigators during the evidentiary assembly phase. At least 2 investigators formally noted in documents that were not presented to the jury as a line of active inquiry that the organization of certain burial sites, the distances between some of the bodies, and the documented time constraints on certain events were more consistent with more than one person being present at the forest on more than one occasion. Those notations were made. They were filed. The trial proceeded on the basis of individual culpability. The question those notations raised has never been formally reopened. The Milat family of Guildford, New South Wales, produced 14 children across 2 generations of documented criminal behavior. Boris Milat, Ivan's older brother, had a conviction for wounding. Richard Milat, another brother, had his own criminal history, and items connected to the Belanglo victims were recovered at his property during the Eagle Vale search phase. Walter Mylar was interviewed by Task Force Air. None of Ivan's brothers were charged in connection with the murders. Police stated publicly that the investigation had concluded Ivan acted alone. The evidential basis for that conclusion was not published. In 2010, 16 years after Ivan Milat's arrest, a 19-year-old named Matthew Milat Ivan's grand-nephew, lured a school friend named David Ochterlony, 17, into Belanglo State Forest and killed him with an axe. Matthew Milat filmed the killing on a mobile phone. He told acquaintances he had committed the murder to follow in his great-uncle's footsteps. He was convicted in 2012 and sentenced to a minimum of 43 years. The location of the killing was not random. Belanglo State Forest carried specific meaning for this family, meaning that predated Ivan's crimes and that no investigation has mapped in full. The question that the Matthew Milat case forces into focus is not whether violence runs in families. It does, and the psychology of that transmission is well documented. The question is whether Belanglo State Forest was known to the Milat family as a location before the backpacker murders began, and whether the family's familiarity with that forest and its uses extended beyond Ivan alone. Ivan's professional access to the forest is documented in Roads and Traffic Authority employment records. His family's operational familiarity with the forest, and with what that forest could conceal, is a question the conviction formally closed without formally answering. Ivan Milat was convicted of 7 murders. The question of how many deaths he may have been connected to across a broader timeline has never been formally resolved. Investigative journalist Derek Pedley and criminologist Paul Wilson independently examined a series of disappearances along the Hume and Federal Highway corridors that fell outside the 1989-1993 timeframe of Milat's official victims. Several of those disappearances dated to the mid-1970s, when Ivan Milat was in his late 20s and living along the same geographic corridor. New South Wales Police acknowledged publicly in 2005 that investigations into potential additional victims remained formally open. No additional charges were ever laid. Milat himself, during the 23 years he spent incarcerated at Goulburn Correctional Centre, consistently refused to speak to detectives about uncharged offences. He gave no formal interviews. He made no confessions. He died of esophageal cancer on the 27th of October 2019, having communicated nothing in 23 years that could extend the evidentiary record by a single name. What Detective Senior Constable Pamela Young noted in her 2001 internal review of the Unsolved Disappearances file, a review that was not released publicly, was a distinction that has operational significance. The absence of bodies during the intervals between confirmed Milat victims does not constitute evidence of dormancy. It constitutes evidence of an absence of discovery. A dormant predator and an undetected predator produce the same observable record: silence. The difference between those two interpretations is not semantic. It is a question of how many names are still missing from the documented count, and whether anyone is still looking for them. Ivan Milat died in custody with 7 convictions, no finding of accomplices, no full accounting of potential additional victims, and no resolved answer to the question raised in Task Force Air's own internal documentation, whether the crimes at Belanglo State Forest were, in every instance, the work of one man working alone. The New South Wales coroner conducted no formal inquest into the murders following the 1996 conviction. The case was considered closed by virtue of the verdict. In legal terms, that is an accurate statement. In forensic and investigative terms, a closed case and a complete case are not the same thing. A verdict resolves criminal liability for the charges brought. It does not resolve questions that were not put to the jury. It does not fill the gaps that the investigation chose not to pursue. It does not answer the notations filed and set aside. The distinction is administrative. Its consequences are not. Paul Onions returned to Australia in 1996 to testify at the trial. He identified Ivan Milat in court as the man who had attacked him on the highway on the 25th of January 1990. After the verdict, he gave a brief statement and returned to England. In 2019, following Milat's death, he gave a single interview. In it, he said that he had always wondered, quietly, consistently, across the intervening 29 years, whether, if his police report had been acted upon in 1990, the 7 people buried in Belanglo would have lived. He did not elaborate on that statement. He did not need to. The arithmetic is not complicated. The report was filed on the 25th of January 1990. The last confirmed victim, Anya Habshid, disappeared in December 1991. 23 months. At least 5 people. 1 document. Sitting in a file. What you just watched is not the story of a monster who was caught. It is the story of a system that was handed the answer in January 1990 and chose, at every subsequent decision point, the path of administrative convenience over the path of investigation. Ivan Milat did not kill because he was invisible. He killed because the infrastructure that should have stopped him was never designed to connect the dots it already held. That is not an anomaly in this case. It is the pattern, and patterns by definition repeat. If a formal police report, filed the same day as the attack at the nearest available station, containing a physical description, a vehicle description, and a weapon description, can sit unread in a system for 4 years while people are murdered on the same road, what confidence do you have that the reports filed today are being read with the attention they require? How many disappearances along highways, across jurisdictions, in the administrative gaps between separate police territories, are being cross-referenced in real time right now? And how many are sitting in a system that will only connect them after the bodies are found? Do you still believe that the conviction of Ivan Milat represented the complete answer to what happened in Belanglo State Forest? Or does the timeline of this case suggest that the full answer was something the system was structurally incapable of finding? If this episode opened something in you, a doubt, a suspicion, a need to understand more, subscribe to Dark Down Under and turn on notifications. Not for us, but because every episode here is one more layer you remove from the version you were sold. That is what this channel exists to do, to take the light into the places that were always meant to stay dark. Your subscription carries that further. But there is something about what happened in the northern suburbs of Adelaide that will make you question everything you just learned. Because the pattern you watched tonight, the pattern of a community that collectively looked away, of a perpetrator who operated in plain sight for years, of a system that had the information and did not act, does not end in Belanglo State Forest. In the next episode, 6 plastic barrels sealed with acid, 8 bodies inside them, a disused bank vault in a town of 400 people, and a man named John Bunting who had already been reported to police before the first murder and was not stopped. That story begins exactly where this one ends.